Good morning. Here's an introduction to all the MPs. So it's Bill C-4, and they're doing a vote, and every single MP you'll get a look at. Now, this is 2 in the morning, so this is looking at them in some ways at their worst. It's, you can see it's 40 minutes, but it's good. Check it out.
Members who will vote by video conference has been received.
The following one. Ms. Qualtrough, seconded by Mr. Rodriguez, moved that Bill C-4, an act relating to certain measures in response to COVID-19, be now read a second time and referred to a committee of the whole. All those in favor of the motion and participating in person will please rise.
Rodriguez.
Mr. Rodriguez.
Mr. Sajan.
Mr. Sajan.
Mr. Holland.
Mr. Holland.
Ms. Freeland.
Ms. Freeland.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Qualtrough.
Ms. Qualtrough.
Madame Le Boutillier.
Madame Le Boutillier.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Ms. Chager.
Ms. Chager.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Sobera.
Mr. Sobera.
Mrs. Jordan.
Mrs. Jordan.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Dollywall.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Mr. El Khoury.
Ms. Zerowitz.
Ms. Zerowitz.
Mr. Easter.
Mr. Easter.
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Monsieur Robillard.
Mr. Robillard.
Mr. Kuzmarczyk.
Mr. Kuzmarczyk.
Ms. Ratanzi.
Ms. Ratanzi.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Van Biden.
Mr. Van Biden.
Monsieur Deltel.
Mr. Deltel.
Monsieur Martel.
Mr. Martel.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Cumming.
Mr. Cumming.
Miss Gray.
Miss Gray.
Monsieur D'Entremont.
Monsieur D'Entremont.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Mr. Lehoux.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Padzer.
Mr. Padzer.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Viersen.
Mr. Viersen.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Couric.
Mr. Couric.
Monsieur Blanchette.
Monsieur Blanchette.
Madame Gill.
Madame Gill.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Savard Tremblay.
Monsieur Savard Tremblay.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame Normandin.
Madame Normandin.
Madame Michaud.
Madame Michaud.
Monsieur Brunel Duceppe.
Monsieur Brunel Duceppe.
Mr. Singh.
Mr. Singh.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Miss May, Saanich Gulf Islands.
Miss May, Saanich Gulf Islands.
Que tous ceux qui s'opposent à la motion et
All those opposed, please rise.
We will now call members who are participating by video conference one by one in alphabetical order and by party based on the list at the table. After you have been called, indicate whether you vote for or against the motion. Please ensure that your camera is turned on at all times and your microphone is turned on only when voting. Les députés du Parti libéral.
Members of the Liberal Party.
Algabra.
Mr. Algabra.
I vote in favor.
Mr. Algabra, pour.
Mr. Amos.
Je vote en faveur.
Mr. Amos, for.
Miss Anand.
Je vote pour la motion. Merci.
Miss Anand, pour.
Mr. Anand Sangre.
I vote in favor.
Fernanda Sangari, pour.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Arsenault, for.
Mr. Area.
I vote in favor.
Mr. Area, for.
Mr. Badaway.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Badaway, for.
Mr. Bagnall. Mr. Bagnall. Mr. Baines.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Baines, for.
Mr. Baker.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Baker, pour 4.
Mr. Baptiste.
I vote in favor.
Mr. Baptiste, 4, pour.
Mr. Beach.
I vote in favor.
Mr. Beach, 4, pour.
Madame Bandayan.
Je vote en faveur de la motion, Monsieur le Président.
Madame Bandayan, pour 4.
Madame Bessette.
Je vote pour la motion.
Madame Bessette, pour 4.
Madame Bibeau.
Je vote pour la motion.
Madame Bibeau, pour 4.
Mr. Biddle.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Biddle, 4, pour.
Mr. Blair.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Blair, 4, pour.
Mr. Blois.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Blois, pour 4.
Mr. Brettina. Mr. Brettina. Madame Brière.
Je vote pour la motion.
Madame Brière, pour 4.
Mr. Casey.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Casey, 4, pour.
Monsieur Champagne.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Champagne, pour 4.
Mr. Chen.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Chen, 4, pour.
I vote in favor.
Monsieur Cormier.
Just once, folks.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Cormier, pour 4.
Miss De Brusen.
I vote in favor of the motion.
De Brusen, 4, pour.
Miss Demoff.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Moff, 4, pour.
Miss Dillon.
Je vote pour.
Ms. Dillon, pour 4.
Mr. Dong.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Dong, 4, pour.
Monsieur Drouin.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Drouin, pour 4.
Monsieur Dubourg.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Dubourg, pour 4.
Monsieur Duclos.
Je vote pour la motion.
Duclos, pour 4.
Mr. Duguid.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Duguid, 4, pour.
Miss Duncan, Etobicoke North.
I vote for the motion.
Miss Duncan, Etobicoke North, 4, pour.
Mr. Ellis.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Ellis, 4, pour.
Mr. Erskine Smith.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Erskine Smith, 4, pour.
Monsieur Fergus.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Fergus, pour 4.
Mr. Fillmore.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Fillmore, pour 4, pour.
Mr. Finnegan.
Je vote. Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Finnegan, pour 4.
Mr. Fonseca.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Fonseca, 4, pour.
Madame Fortier.
Je vote pour la motion.
And Fortier, pour 4.
Mr. Frederick-Scottos.
I vote for the motion.
Frederick-Scottos, 4, pour.
Mr. Fraser.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Fraser, 4, pour.
Miss Fry.
I vote for the motion.
Ms. Fry, pour 4.
Monsieur Garneau.
Je vote pour la motion.
Garneau, pour 4.
Mr. Gerritsen.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Gerritsen, 4, pour.
Ms. Gould.
I vote for the motion.
Gould, 4, pour.
Monsieur Guilbeault.
Je vote en faveur de la motion.
Mr. Guilbeault, pour 4.
Ms. Haydu.
I vote for the motion.
4, pour.
Mr. Hardy.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Hardy, 4, pour.
Mr. Housefather.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Housefather, 4, pour.
Miss Hutchins.
Je vote pour la motion, Monsieur le Président.
Ms. Hutchings, for.
Monsieur Iacono.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Iacono, for.
Ms. Jazik.
I vote for the motion.
Ms. Jazik, for.
Madame Joly.
Je vote pour la motion.
Madame Joly, for.
Miss Jones.
I vote for the motion.
Jones, for.
Mr. Johari.
I vote for the motion.
Johari, for.
Mr. Callaway.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Callaway, for.
Miss Cara.
I vote for the motion.
Ms. Cara, for.
Madame Koutrakis.
Je vote pour la motion.
Madame Koutrakis, for.
Madame Lalonde. Madame Lalonde.
Je vote pour la motion.
Madame Lalonde, for.
Miss Lambropoulos.
Je vote en faveur de la motion.
Ms. Lambropoulos, for.
Monsieur Lametti.
Je vote pour la motion.
Lametti, for.
Miss Latanzio.
Je vote pour la motion.
Ms. Latanzio, for.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Je vote pour la motion.
Est-ce que vous... Oh, voilà. Merci.
Monsieur Lauzon, for.
Monsieur Leblanc.
Je vote pour la motion.
Leblanc, for.
Monsieur Lefebvre.
Je vote pour la motion.
Lefebvre, for.
Monsieur Lightbound.
Je vote pour la motion.
Monsieur Lightbound, for.
Mr. Long.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Long, for.
Mr. Longfield.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Longfield, for.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga, for.
Monsieur McKinnon Gatineau.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. McKinnon, for.
Mr. Maloney.
I vote for the motion.
Maloney, for.
Madame Martinez Farada.
Je vote pour la motion.
Madame Martinez Farada, for.
Mr. May Cambridge.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Cambridge, for.
Mrs. McCrimmon.
I vote for the motion.
McCrimmon, for.
Mr. McDonald.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. McDonald, for.
Mr. McGinty.
I vote in favor of the motion.
McGinty, for.
Miss McKenna.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Kenna, for.
Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam, for.
Mr. McLeod Northwest Territories.
I vote for the motion.
McLeod Northwest Territories, for.
Mr. Mendocino.
I vote for the motion.
Mendocino, for.
Monsieur Miller.
Je vote pour la motion.
Miller, for.
Miss Monsef.
Bon matin, je vote pour.
Miss Monsef, for.
Miss Murray.
I vote for the motion.
Miss Murray, for.
Miss Ing.
I vote for the motion.
Ing, for.
Miss O'Connell.
I vote in favor of the motion.
O'Connell, for.
Mr. O'Regan.
I vote in favor of the motion.
O'Regan, for.
Miss Pittspa-Taylor.
Je vote pour la motion.
Miss Petitpot-Taylor, for.
Mr. Pulowski.
For the motion.
Pulowski, for.
Mr. Regan.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Regan, for.
Mr. Rogers.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Rogers, 4, poor.
Mrs. Romanado.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Romanado, 4, poor.
Ms. Sahota Brampton North.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Ms. Sahota Brampton North, 4, poor.
Mr. Saini.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Saini, poor, 4.
Monsieur Sanson.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Sanson, poor, 4.
Mr. Senga.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Senga, 4, poor.
Mr. Sarai.
I vote for the motion.
Sarai, 4, poor.
Mr. Scarpellegia.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Scarpellegia, poor, 4.
Monsieur Shifke.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Shifke, poor, 4.
Mrs. Schultz.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Ms. Schulte, please repeat. The video did not kick in.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Thank you.
Schultz, 4, poor.
Monsieur Seri.
Monsieur le Président, je suis en faveur de la motion.
Mr. Serra, poor, 4.
Ms. Gros.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Scroll, 4, poor.
Madame Shanahan.
Je vote en faveur de la motion.
Madam Shanahan, poor, 4.
Mr. Sheehan.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Sheehan, 4, poor.
Mr. Sidhu Brampton East.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Sidhu Brampton East, 4, poor.
Miss Sidhu Brampton South.
I vote for the motion.
Ms. Sidhu Brampton South, 4, poor.
Mr. Sims.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Sims, 4, poor.
Mr. Spengeman.
Je vote en faveur de la motion.
Spengeman, poor, 4.
Miss Tassi.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Ms. Tassi, 4, poor.
Monsieur Trudeau.
Je vote en faveur de la motion.
Monsieur Trudeau, poor, 4.
Mr. Turnbull.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Turnbull, 4, poor.
Mr. Vancouverden.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Vancouverden, 4, poor.
Monsieur Vandal.
Je vote pour la motion.
Monsieur Vandal, poor, 4.
Miss Vandenbeld.
I vote for the motion.
Vandenbeld, 4, poor.
Mr. Vaughn.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Vaughn, poor, 4.
Mr. Varani.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Varani, poor, 4.
Mr. Weiler.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Weiler, 4, poor.
Mr. Wilkinson.
I vote in favor.
Mr. Wilkinson, 4, poor.
Miss Yip.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Miss Yip, 4, poor.
Miss Young.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Miss Young, 4, poor.
Mrs. Zaid.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mrs. Zaid, 4, poor.
Miss Zan.
Je vote pour la motion.
Miss Zan, 4, poor.
Monsieur Zuberi.
Je vote pour la motion.
Monsieur Zuberi, poor, 4.
Les députés du Parti conservateur.
Members of the Conservative Party.
Mr. Albutev.
I vote in favor.
Mr. Albutev, 4, poor.
Mr. Aitchison.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Aitchison, 4, poor.
Miss Alislav.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Miss Alislav, 4, poor.
Mr. Allison.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Allison, 4, poor.
Mr. Arnold.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Arnold, 4, poor.
Mr. Barlow.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Barlow, 4, poor.
Mr. Barrett.
I vote yay.
Mr. Barrett, 4, poor.
Mr. Benson.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Benson, pour.
Monsieur Berthold.
Je vote en faveur de la motion.
Mr. Berthold, for.
Mr. Bazan.
Please record me in the affirmative, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Bazan, pour.
Mrs. Block.
I vote yay.
Mrs. Block, pour.
Mr. Brangden.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Bragdon, pour.
Mr. Brassard.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Brassard, pour.
Mr. Calkins.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Calkins, pour.
Mr. Carey.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Carey, pour.
Mr. Chu.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Chu, pour.
Mr. Dalton.
Je vote pour la motion.
Dalton, pour.
Mr. Davidson.
I vote in favor of the motion, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Davidson, pour.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Doherty, pour.
Mr. Dowdall.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Dowdall, pour.
Mr. Dreeshen.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Dreeshen, pour.
Mr. Duncan, Stormont Dundas, South Glengarry.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Duncan, Stormont Dundas, South Glengarry, pour.
Mr. Epp.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Epp, pour.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford's Lloydminster.
I vote for the motion.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford's Lloydminster, pour.
Mr. Falk, Provencher.
I vote for the motion.
Falk, Provencher, pour.
Mr. Fast.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Fast, pour.
Miss Findlay, South Surrey, White Rock.
I vote for the motion.
Miss Finley, South Surrey, White Rock, pour.
Mrs. Gallant.
I vote for the motion.
Mrs. Gallant, pour.
Monsieur Généreux.
Je vote pour la motion.
Généreux, pour.
Ms. Gledoux.
I vote for the motion.
Ms. Gledoux, can you repeat? The camera did not kick in.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Thank you.
Ms. Gledoux, pour.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur le Président, je vote pour la motion.
Monsieur Godin, pour.
Mr. Hallan.
I vote for the motion.
Hallan, pour.
Miss Harder.
I vote for the motion.
Miss Harder, pour.
Mr. Hoback.
I vote for the motion.
Okay.
Mr. Hoback, pour.
Miss Jensen.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Miss Jensen, pour.
Mr. Generou.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Generou, pour.
Mr. Kent.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Kent, pour.
Mr. Cram.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Cram, pour.
Mrs. Cousy.
Je vote pour la motion. I vote for the motion.
Mrs. Cousy, pour.
Mr. Lake.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Lake, pour.
Mr. Lawrence.
I vote for the motion.
Lawrence, pour.
Mr. Lloyd.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Lloyd, pour.
Mr. Lobb.
I vote for the motion.
Pour.
Mr. Lukowski.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Lukiski, pour.
Mr. McGuire.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Maguire, pour.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Speaker, I vote for the motion.
Macaulay, Edmonton West, pour.
Mr. McLean.
I vote for the motion.
McLean, pour.
Mrs. McLeod, Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Mr. Speaker, I vote for the motion.
Mrs. McLeod, Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou, pour.
Mr. Malilo.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Malilo, pour.
Mr. Moore.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Moore, please repeat. The camera did not kick in.
I vote for the motion.
Thank you.
Moore, pour.
Mr. Morant.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Morant, pour.
Mr. Morrison.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Morrison, pour.
Mr. Mott.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Mott, pour.
Mr. Nader.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Nader, pour.
Mr. O'Toole.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. O'Toole, pour.
Monsieur Paulus.
Je vote pour la motion. Je vote pour la motion.
Monsieur Paulus, pour.
Monsieur Reyes.
Je vote pour la motion.
Monsieur Reyes, pour.
Mr. Redekop.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Redekop, pour.
Mr. Reed.
I vote for the motion.
Reed, pour.
Miss Rude.
I vote for the motion.
Ms. Rude, can you repeat? We did not get the camera on.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Thank you.
Rude, pour.
Mr. Ruff.
I vote for the motion.
Pour.
Ms. Sahota, Calgary Skyview.
I vote for the motion.
Ms. Sahota, Calgary Skyview, pour.
Mr. Schmale.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Schmale, can you repeat? The camera did not come on.
I vote for the motion.
Thank you.
Schmale, pour.
Mr. Seaback.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Seaback, pour.
Ms. Sin.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Sin, pour.
Mr. Shipley.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Shipley, pour.
Mr. Sloan.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Sloan, pour.
Mr. Soroka.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Soroka, pour.
Mr. Stanton.
Je vote en faveur de la motion.
Mr. Stanton, pour.
Mr. Strahl.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Strahl, pour.
Mrs. Stubbs.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Stubbs, pour.
Mr. Sweet.
I vote for the motion.
Sweet, pour.
Mr. Tucker.
Vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Tucker, pour.
Mr. Upal.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Upal, pour.
Mr. Van Pupta.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Van Pupta, pour.
Mrs. Vecchio.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Ms. Vecchio, can you repeat? The camera did not connect.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Thank you.
Mrs. Vecchio, pour.
Mr. Vidal.
I vote for the motion.
Vidal, pour.
Mr. Viss.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Viss, pour.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
I vote for the motion.
Wagenthal, pour.
Mr. Waugh.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Waugh, pour.
Mr. Weber.
I vote for the motion.
Weber, pour.
Mrs. Wong.
I vote for the motion.
Mrs. Wong, can you repeat? The camera did not kick in.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Thank you.
Mrs. Wong, pour.
Mr. Yurdiga.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Yurdiga, pour.
Les députés du Bloc québécois.
The members of the Bloc Québécois Party.
Monsieur Barcelou Duval.
Je vote pour la motion, Monsieur le Président.
Monsieur Barcelou Duval, pour.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Je vote pour la motion.
Beaulieu, pour.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Je vote en faveur de cette motion, Monsieur le Président.
Monsieur Bergeron, pour.
Madame Bérubé.
Je vote pour la motion.
Madame Bérubé, pour.
Monsieur Blanchette-Jonca.
Je vote pour la motion.
Monsieur Blanchette-Jonca, pour.
Monsieur Boudria.
Je vote pour la motion.
Boudria, pour.
Madame Chabot.
Je vote pour la motion.
Madame Chabot, pour.
Monsieur Champoux.
Je vote pour la motion.
Monsieur Champoux, pour.
Madame Charbonneau.
Je vote pour la motion.
Madame Charbonneau, pour.
Madame Desbiens.
Je vote pour la motion, Monsieur le Président.
Madame Desbiens, pour.
Monsieur Desilets.
Je vote pour la motion, Monsieur le Président.
Monsieur Desilets, pour.
Monsieur Fortin.
Je vote pour la motion.
Monsieur Fortin, pour.
Madame Godreau.
Je vote pour la motion.
Madame Godreau, pour.
Madame Larouche.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président. Je vote pour la motion.
Madame Larouche, pour.
Monsieur Lemire.
Bonsoir, Monsieur le Président. Je vote pour la motion.
Monsieur Lemire, pour.
Madame Posé.
En faveur de la motion, Monsieur le Président.
Madame Posé, pour.
Monsieur Perron.
Je vote en faveur de la motion.
Monsieur Perron, pour.
Monsieur Plamondon.
Je vote en faveur.
Plamondon, pour.
Monsieur Simard.
Je vote pour la motion, Monsieur le Président.
Monsieur Simard, pour.
Monsieur Sainte-Marie.
Je vote pour la motion.
Monsieur Sainte-Marie, pour.
Monsieur Thériault.
Je vote pour la motion.
Monsieur Thériault, pour.
Monsieur Trudel.
Je vote pour la motion.
Monsieur Trudel, pour.
Madame Vignola.
Je vote pour la motion.
Madame Vignola, pour.
Les députés du Parti...
Members of the Green Party.
No.
NPD.
Excuse, les
I'm so sorry. Members of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Angus.
I vote in favor.
Mr. Angus, pour.
Miss Ashton.
I vote in favor.
Miss Ashton, pour.
Mr. Backrack.
I vote for the motion.
Backrack, pour.
Miss Blaney, North Island, Powell River.
Mr. Speaker, I vote for the motion.
Miss Blaney, North Island, Powell River, pour.
Monsieur Boulouris.
Je vote en faveur de la motion.
Monsieur Boulouris, pour.
Mr. Cannings.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Cannings, pour.
Miss Collins.
Je vote pour la motion.
Miss Collins, pour.
Mr. Davies.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Davies, pour.
Mr. Duval.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Duval, pour.
Mr. Garrison.
I vote for the motion.
Garrison.
Mr. Garrison, can you repeat? The camera did not go off.
Mr. Speaker, I vote for the motion.
Thank you.
Mr. Garrison, pour.
Ms. Gazan.
Je vote pour la motion.
Gazan, pour.
Mr. Green.
Mr. Speaker, I vote for the motion.
Green 4, pour.
Mr. Harris.
Mr. Speaker, I vote for the motion.
Mr. Harris 4, pour.
Madame Hughes.
Je vote pour la motion.
Madame Hughes pour 4.
Ms. Kwan.
I vote for the motion.
Ms. Kwan 4, pour.
Mr. Massey.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Massey pour 4.
Ms. Matheson.
I vote for the motion.
Matheson 4, pour.
Ms. McPherson.
Je vote pour la motion.
Ms. McPherson pour 4.
Ms. Kukuk.
Je vote pour la motion.
Ms. Kakak pour 4.
Les députés du Parti vert.
Members of the Green Party.
Mrs. Atwin.
I vote for the motion.
Ms. Atwin 4, pour.
Mr. Manley.
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Manley 4, pour.
Les députés indépendants.
Independent members.
Mr. Tabara.
Vote for the motion.
Mr. Tabara 4, pour.
Ms. Wilson-Raybould.
I vote for the motion.
Ms. Wilson-Raybould 4, pour.
Tel que mentionné dans ma déclaration.
As mentioned in my statement on Wednesday, the 23rd of September 2020, if you heard the question but could not vote because of technical problems that are now resolved, please activate the raised hand function and the chair will recognize you.
Mr. Massey? Mr. Bagnell?
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Bagnell pour 4.
Mr. Brattina?
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Bertina 4, pour.
Mr. Hussein?
Speaker,
I vote for the motion.
Mr. Hussein 4, pour.
Mr. Massey?
Mr. Speaker, I vote for the motion.
Very good.
Mr.
4. Yeah.
Yeas pour 306, 306. Nays contre 0, nul.
Je déclare la motion adoptée.
The motion is carried.
Accordingly, the bill stands referred to a committee of the whole. Pursuant to order made earlier today, Bill C-4. Je m'excuse. OK, Monsieur Reyes, vous avez un appel.
Point of order, Mr. Reyes? Yes, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to get some clarifications. During the vote, we saw several members disconnect their camera. I thought that the standing order was very clear. I wondered if the IT staff could review this. You've mentioned several times that this needs to be done properly. If there's ever a confidence vote, we need clear rules because we're talking about important decisions. I would ask you to clarify this and ensure that we apply the rules correctly.
Comme j'ai mentionné tantôt,
as I mentioned earlier, it is very important that the camera stay on throughout the entirety of the vote, from the very beginning to the end. The camera must remain on.
Est-ce que je peux finir, puis ensuite on va aller.
May I conclude, and then we'll go on to points of order?
Order made earlier today, Bill C-4, an act relating to certain measures in response to COVID-19, is deemed considered in committee of the whole, deemed reported without amendment, deemed concurred in at report, deemed read a third time, and passed.
Third reading is failed. Troisième lecture de ce projet de loi.
Autre appel au règlement.
Another point of order. Mr. Reyes. My question is, will this rule be applied and cancel the votes of those whose camera did not remain on?
These people are crazy. This is going to be a disaster.